As you enter strategic planning, of course, we spend time looking in and we look up and we look back at past performance. But before we look ahead, we need to make sure we look around, that we don't get insular in our thinking, and we make sure we're looking at correct feedback loops of what reality is before we really define and anchor the plan going forward. So 3 classic tools we're going to look at and leverage. I want to give you some best practices of how to get the most out of them. You're probably familiar with the vintage SWOT analysis, so strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. But how do you get the most out of it? Well, first, think about if you're going to use it at a macro level or a micro level. Are you going to do this at the enterprise level, or are you going to do this by department, by function, by customer, by market, or both? So like in my company, we're going to do departmental, then we're going to do overall as a company. You also want to think who's going to be your stakeholders. So example, we're going to do this at a departmental level. We're going to do this as a leadership team. We're also going to involve the board and ownership in a SWOT exercise. We're also going to have a focus group of customers be stakeholders and have them provide a SWOT. So we've got data from very different perspectives and very different orientations all speaking into this process. But if you're going to do that, you also want to look at how you're going to force rank it. And frankly, this has been huge for us differentiating value, because not all strengths are equal, not all weaknesses are equal. So having each one of those groups force rank and provide some weighting to them allows you to come back and look at the data from multiple sources and then say, what are we going to do with it? Which is the last piece. What's going to be your leverage strategy? So some classic ways to take what's just initially a bunch of words and data, hopefully informed by critical analysis and surveys and industry reports. Then you go, are you going to do an SO strategy? We're going to use our strengths to seize and leverage opportunity we've identified. Is this going to be an ST strategy, where we're going to leverage strengths to actually mitigate against threats? We're going to build a bit of a moat around our business. Other times, you may have had your force rank reveal there's some critical weaknesses. And the question is, are you going to do a WO strategy, where you're going to offset weaknesses to prevent or enable the business to really seize opportunities? That if we're going to grab that brilliant opportunity next year, we've got to shore up this gap area. Or maybe it's a defensive play in light of risk analysis that you got to do a WT strategy, where your weakness is actually got to be shored up to mitigate a burgeoning threat your team has identified as being probable and significant. So those are some ways to think about how to leverage a classic exercise, but make sure you get the most insight in the look around exercise of your planning process. Let's look at something else, because we want to keep making sure we're balancing internal perspective and external perspective. So a classic thing we do every year is to do a PESTEL analysis. So PESTEL is just a fancy acronym for a couple different dimensions of external things that may be changing your internal reality. And it can be both positive and negative. So this is political, economic, societal, technological, environmental, and legislative. We're going to give you some processing questions about how to use this, but essentially we want to look at these different domains and say, are things changing, whether they have changed or they're about to change, in political culture, in the economy? This could be interest rates, liquidity, this could be buying power, society, social things could be everything from social sentiment, this could be consumer mindset and trends, this could be looking at things like generational shifts, this could be, when you get to technology, that's obvious, this is both new tech, but tech expectation, tech possibilities. Environmental, how a shift in climate or even your local state or city environment around your physical plant property shifting that changes either possibilities or causes potential problems. And of course, legislative, we're looking at regulatory changes. This could be things that have already happened or on the verge of happening. And for all of these, you want to plot this out and go, from a risk perspective, if these are negative considerations, you're going, what's the impact? Like, how significant is that if that were to happen? And then what's the probability? And so we plot this out in a bit of a risk heat mapping on the negatives of this. But for all those things, change is not bad. Change usually represents opportunity for somebody. And so you also want to plot out for the things that seem to be opportunistic, what is the scale or scope of impact or benefit we could realize? And what's the feasibility it would take to grab a hold of that for any one of these factors? An aging population may be a risk for one sector, but it's an opportunity for another, because you get to sell retirement properties or products, things like that. So SWOT, PESTEL, and then a classic thing that's been around for decades coming out of the Harvard Business School is Michael Porter's 5 forces. And in this, it's wanting to make sure that this can be fairly me against the world, and so you can be assessing how we're doing and what's happening in the universe, but you also want to make sure you look at your market. And so this says, let's look at the level of rivalry, basically the competitive landscape of your product space. How many competitors are there? Is this a highly dense and popular space? And let's look at some forces that may be changing that drive this. So one is we're going to look at, are there new players? Either currently, like is there a ton of people competing for the same space, same customers as you, or is it an easy access? Are the barrier to entry low? It doesn't require a lot of capital. It's easy to stand up a single shingle and compete with you. What are the factors that determine the preservation and the kind of strength of your position in that area? Then you also will look at, well, what's the role of the buying power of your customers? And this is essentially, how much do your customers determine your flexibility? Is there high cost sensitivity? Is this a highly needed product where there's ways to kind of build a moat around your relationship with those customers? Or are they able to put a lot of pressure and demand, price compression, products in a particular way? Next you're looking at is, what's the availability of subs? How easily could a buyer or a customer substitute your product? This is something you need to be critically aware of, because if there's either shifting consumption models or there's alternative products and programs that are not the exact thing but allow them to do away with it, that can shift your strength and opportunities to really flex in all these other ideas your teams come up with. The other piece is to make sure, particularly in light of the last few years, what's your supplier's power? How much dependency do you have on single source providers of either raw materials or upstream goods and services that you need to deliver product? And what's your ability to either diversify or control that? So can this represent a threat, or does this represent an ability for them to leverage your cost of goods, impeding your ability to actually compete in this space? Now, this has been around for decades. In the last 10, 20 years, it's been folks who said, well, these 5 forces are still universally true. There's probably 1 or 2 other forces emerging. So you may be in a space that needs to think about what's called complementers. So this is add-on services that are not your core product, but affect the way your product is viewed. If in the automotive world, think about aftermarket features. In the tech world, think about a hardware product where software is actually changing the way customers use and buy your product and what they may expect of it. And then the other is the world of digital assets, particularly unowned digital assets. This means the abundance of databases, email lists, internet content providers who are both curating the way customers seek and access things and shaping the way they perceive this space. Now, this can be a bit overwhelming to look at all this and say, do we got to do all this every year? And the reality is, find the cadence that works for you. I find doing the SWOT annually is a good return on investment of the energy to look at what's changed this year in the business and what's changing around us. The PESTEL analysis can take a lot of work to do the first time. We honestly just refresh it every year or two, unless there's been dramatic changes. And when it comes to the 5 forces, really a question of how dynamic your marketplace is. So if there's a ton going on here, you may find yourself needing to do this frequently, or you may be fine doing one assessment and then every year or two doing a light assessment, and every 3 years doing a deeper dive. Find the return on effort that works for you, and let this serve your look around exercises before you figure out what you're going to do looking ahead.